The clock struck 6 a.m., but the house on Market Drive was already awake, or rather, it had never slept. In the dim glow of a Florida dawn, the living room stood frozen, a tableau of ordinary chaos. A blanket crumpled on the couch, a laptop perched precariously on its edge, a pillow mashed into the cushions. The air smelled faintly of coffee and sweat, the remnants of a night that had stretched too long. Outside, the cicadas hummed their relentless chorus, oblivious to the stillness within. Then came the sound of a sharp, staccato crack, followed by another, and another, until the count reached 9. It was not the sound of a door slamming or a child's toy breaking. It was the sound of a life ending. Maria Thompson stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling around the phone, her customs uniform clinging to her like a second skin. The gun, her service weapon, still warm from its deadly work, sat holstered at her hip, a silent witness to the act she'd just committed. Her voice, when it broke through the 911 line, was a jagged whisper. "I just shot him. He was trying to kill me." The operator's calm instructions crackled back, but Maria's eyes were fixed on the living room, where Terry Thompson lay sprawled face down, blood pooling beneath him like a dark halo. 9 bullets. 9 precise, unerring shots. She'd fired them all, and now the world was tilting beneath her feet. Who was this woman, standing at the edge of her own unraveling? To the neighbors, she was the quiet customs agent, the one who waved politely as she left for her shift at the port of Palm Beach. To her children, asleep in their beds down the hall, she was the mother who kissed their foreheads and promised safety. To Terry, her husband of over a decade, she'd been something else entirely, a punching bag, a scapegoat, a shadow to bend and break. But in that moment, as the first sirens wailed in the distance, Maria Thompson was none of those things. She was a question mark, a riddle wrapped in a uniform, a woman who'd crossed a line from which there was no return. The story begins here, in the aftermath of those 9 shots, but its roots stretch back through years of whispered threats and bruised skin, back to a college campus where a shy girl met a man who promised her the world and delivered a cage instead. This is not a tale of heroes and villains, though the law would soon try to paint it that way. It's a descent into the marrow of a marriage, where love and fear tangled until one consumed the other. It's the story of a morning that began with an argument and ended with a body, and of the woman who pulled the trigger not once, but 9 times while the world slept around her. Rewind the clock 5 hours. It's 1 a.m., and Maria is on the phone, her voice soft but strained, coaxing Terry through the night as he drives home. The line crackles with his anger sharp, cutting words about her failures, her inadequacies. She's heard them all before, a litany of disdain that's worn grooves into her soul. The children sleep, their small chests rising and falling in the next room, unaware that their father's rage is a storm gathering strength. Maria's eyes burn with fatigue. She's due at work in 6 hours, but sleep is a luxury she hasn't claimed in days. Terry demands she stay awake, keep him company, and she does because she always does. When he stumbles through the door at 2 a.m., the air shifts. He's a hulking figure, 52 years old, but carrying the weight of a man who's spent decades bending others to his will. His face is flushed, his eyes narrowed, and the argument that began on the phone explodes into the room. "You're useless," he spits, pacing the living room like a caged animal. A shitty wife, a shitty mother. Maria tries to retreat, to soothe, but his voice follows her, a relentless tide. She massages his feet, an old trick to calm him, but it's no use. The threats come next, low and lethal. "I'll kill you one of these days. You and the kids." She believes him. She always has. By 6 a.m., the house is a pressure cooker ready to blow. Maria slips into the bedroom to dress for work, her movements mechanical, uniform on, hair up, earrings in. 15 minutes, the prosecution would later say, of calculated calm. But inside her mind, it's a different story, a whirlwind of terror, a countdown to an inevitable clash. Terry's voice drifts through the walls. "If you come out of that room, I'll kill you." She knows the weapons he's hidden: knives in the couch, a machete by the bed, a golf club within reach. She's seen him wield them before, felt their menace. And now, with her gun belt strapped on, she steps into the living room, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. What happened next is a blur to her, a memory fractured by adrenaline and dread. The first shot, Terry's arm rising. The next 6 as he falls. The final 2 as he lies still. 9 bullets, each one a scream she'd swallowed for years. When the deputies arrive, they find her waiting composed, hollow, her only plea for her children's safety. The living room tells its own tale. No weapon near Terry, just a man caught off guard. But Maria's story is deeper, darker, a labyrinth of pain that defies the neat edges of law. This is where we begin, with a woman, a gun, and a body, and a question that will haunt the courtroom, the town, and the reader. Did Maria Thompson kill to survive or to escape? The truth lies buried in the shadows of Market Drive, waiting to be unearthed. The house on Market Drive was a mausoleum of sleeplessness, its walls steeped in the stale breath of a marriage gone rancid. At 1 a.m., Maria Thompson sat on the edge of the couch, her phone pressed to her ear, its plastic casing warm against her cheek. The living room was a dim cave, lit only by the flicker of a muted TV casting shadows across the coffee table, a clutter of juice boxes, a half-eaten bowl of cereal, the detritus of a life with 2 small children. Outside, the Florida night pressed in, thick with humidity and the drone of cicadas, a sound that grated against her frayed nerves. On the other end of the line, Terry's voice rumbled like distant thunder, low and menacing, punctuated by the hiss of tires on asphalt as he drove home. "Keep me awake, Maria," he'd said when he called an hour ago, his tone more command than request. "Don't you dare fall asleep on me." She hadn't argued. She never did. Her eyes burned, lids heavy from a day that had begun at dawn, packing lunches, dropping the kids at school, an 8-hour shift at the port of Palm Beach scanning cargo for contraband. Now, with her next shift looming at 7 a.m., sleep was a phantom she couldn't chase. But Terry didn't care about that. He cared about control, about her voice tethering him through the dark highways, a lifeline he could yank whenever he pleased. "You still there?" he snapped now, his words slurring slightly, not from drink, but from the exhaustion he'd never admit. "Or are you too busy screwing around to talk to your husband?" "I'm here, Terry," she said softly, her voice a practiced balm. "Just listening." "Listening," he scoffed. "You're always just listening, aren't you? Never got anything to say? Useless." The word landed like a slap, familiar yet sharp. She closed her eyes, picturing him in the driver's seat of his beat-up Ford, broad shoulders hunched, knuckles white on the wheel, his face a mask of perpetual discontent. 13 years her senior, he'd once been a figure of awe to her, confident, worldly, a man who'd swept her off her feet at the University of Florida with promises of a life bigger than her small-town dreams. Now, he was a storm she couldn't outrun. The argument had started hours ago, sparked by something trivial, maybe the way she'd folded his shirts, or the fact that she'd forgotten to call him during her lunch break. With Terry, the fuse was always short, the explosion inevitable. Tonight, it was her silence that set him off. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he growled. "Sitting there like some goddamn saint while I'm out here busting my ass. You're nothing without me, Maria. Nothing." She didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that words were kindling to his fire. Instead, she glanced down the hall toward the children's room, where Micah, 6, and Lily, 7, slept under their superhero blankets. Their door was cracked open, a sliver of nightlight spilling into the corridor, a small comfort she clung to. They hadn't stirred, thank God. The last time Terry came home like this, Micah had wandered out, rubbing his eyes, and Terry had shoved him back to bed with a barked, "Get out of my sight." Maria had spent the next hour stroking her son's hair, whispering apologies into the dark. The clock ticked to 1:30 a.m. Her head throbbed, a dull pulse behind her eyes, but she stayed on the line, murmuring affirmations. "I'm here, Terry. I'm listening," as his tirade rolled on. He ranted about her job, how she thought she was hot shit in her customs uniform, how she couldn't even keep the house clean. "You're a disgrace," he said. "A shitty wife. A shitty mother. What am I even coming home to?" She pressed her lips together, tasting salt tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. She wiped them away quickly, as if he could see her through the phone. By 2 a.m., the headlights of his truck swept across the front windows, slicing through the blinds. Maria stood, smoothing her rumpled t-shirt, her stomach knotting. The front door banged open, and there he was, Terry Thompson, all 6 feet of him, his graying hair disheveled, his plaid shirt damp with sweat. He dropped his keys on the floor with a clatter, not bothering to pick them up, and fixed her with a glare that could have curdled milk. "What are you staring at?" he snarled, kicking off his boots. "Give me a beer." She moved to the fridge on autopilot, her bare feet silent on the tile. The can hissed as she opened it, and she handed it to him without meeting his eyes. He took it, slumping onto the couch with a grunt, his legs sprawling across the cushions. The TV flickered to life as he jabbed the remote, some late-night infomercial blaring about miracle cleaners. "Sit down," he said, patting the spot beside him. It wasn't an invitation. Maria perched on the edge, her hands clasped in her lap. The argument picked up where it left off, seamless as if the phone line had never disconnected. "You think I don't know what you're up to?" he said, taking a swig of beer. "All those hours at work, probably screwing some dockhand behind my back." She shook her head, a reflex. "No, Terry, I'd never. Don't lie to me." His voice boomed, rattling the thin walls. She flinched, glancing toward the kids' room again, praying they wouldn't wake. He leaned closer, his breath sour with beer and bitterness. "You're a slut, Maria. Always have been. I should have left you years ago, but I'm too damn good to you." The words stung, but they weren't new. She'd heard them since 2007, when he'd slipped that ring on her finger and the mask of charm slipped off his face. Back then, at UF, he'd been her first everything. First love, first kiss, first heartbreak. He'd dazzled her with stories of his travels, his swagger a magnet to her quiet insecurity. She'd followed him across states, trained as a customs agent to build a life with him, only to watch that life twist into something unrecognizable. The first time he hit her 2007, a month after their engagement, she'd been too stunned to leave. He'd cried, begged, promised it wouldn't happen again. She'd believed him. She always did. Now, at 3 a.m., the house was a battlefield. Terry paced, beer in hand, his voice rising with each lap around the room. "You're not good enough," he said, pointing at her. "Never have been. Look at this place, messy as hell. And the kids? You're raising them soft, Maria. Weak, like you." She tried to calm him, an old habit. "I'll clean tomorrow, Terry. I'll do better." He laughed, a harsh bark. "Better? You? Don't make me laugh." At 4 a.m., she knelt beside him as he sprawled on the couch, massaging his feet, a trick that sometimes worked. His tirade softened to a mutter, but the threats crept in. "One day, I'll kill you. You and those brats. Cut your damn heads off." Her hands froze, the words sinking into her like blades. He'd said it before dozens of times, but tonight, they felt heavier, realer. She thought of the machete in the bedroom, the knives he hid in the couch cushions, the golf club by the TV. He'd used them to scare her before, once holding a blade to her throat until she sobbed for mercy. By 5 a.m., she was a ghost of herself, hollowed out by fatigue and fear. She tried to call a coworker to cover her shift, but the line went to voicemail. Terry watched her, smirking. "Running away, huh? Good luck with that." She retreated to the bedroom at 6 a.m., the sky outside bruising purple. She pulled on her uniform navy blue, crisp, a shield against the chaos. Her gun belt clicked into place, the weight of the holster grounding her. Through the wall, Terry's voice followed. "If you come out of that room, I'll kill you. You hear me, Maria? I'll end you." 15 minutes. That's how long she stayed there, brushing her hair, slipping in earrings, staring at herself in the mirror, a woman she barely recognized, eyes sunken, jaw tight. 15 minutes of terror masquerading as routine. Her mind raced. "He'll kill me if I leave. He'll kill the kids if I stay." She thought of Micah's small face, Lily's trusting smile. She thought of the hospital visits, neck pain, back pain, injuries she'd blamed on accidents. She thought of the night he'd choked her until she blacked out, waking to his apologies. At 6:10 a.m., she stepped into the living room, her gun at her side, her heart a frantic drum. Terry lay on the couch, laptop on his lap, blanket tangled around him. He looked up, eyes blazing. "You think you can just walk out?" he sneered. "Go ahead. See what happens." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The first shot rang out, and the night that never ended finally broke. The air in the living room thickened as Maria stepped across the threshold, her boots soft against the hardwood but heavy with intent. It was 6:10 a.m., and the world outside Market Drive was stirring, birds chirping, a neighbor's sprinkler hissing to life, but inside, time had collapsed into a single, suffocating moment. Terry lay sprawled on the couch, his bulk sinking into the cushions, the blanket twisted around his thighs like a shroud. The laptop glowed on his lap, casting a blue sheen across his face, illuminating the sneer that curled his lips as he looked up at her. "You think you can just walk out?" he said, his voice a low growl, dripping with mockery. "Go ahead, Maria. See what happens." Her breath caught, a sharp hitch in her chest. The gun at her hip, her service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock she'd carried for years, felt alive, its weight pressing against her like a heartbeat. She didn't answer him. Words had long ceased to matter between them. They were just fuel for his fire, kindling for the rage that smoldered in his eyes. She stood there, framed in the doorway, her uniform crisp against the chaos of the room, her hands trembling at her sides. 15 minutes in the bedroom had been a lifetime. 15 minutes of his threats echoing through the walls, 15 minutes of her mind spinning like a trapped animal. "He'll kill me. He'll kill the kids. There's no way out." Terry shifted, propping himself up on one elbow, the blanket sliding to the floor. His chest was bare, his skin mottled with age and scars, a testament to a life lived hard. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice rising. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too stupid to speak?" He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that ricocheted off the walls. The laptop teetered, and he steadied it with a careless hand, his eyes never leaving her. "Go on then. Run off to your precious job. Leave me here with those brats you can't even raise right." Something snapped inside her, not a loud break, but a quiet, irrevocable fracture. Her hand moved, slow at first, then swift, fingers curling around the grip of the Glock. She didn't think about it, not consciously. It was muscle memory, honed by years of training, years of standing at the edge of danger on the docks. But this wasn't a smuggler or a threat in a shipping container. This was Terry, her husband, the man who'd promised her forever and delivered a decade of hell. Her thumb flicked the holster's release, and the gun was free, cold metal against her palm. "Put that down," he said, his tone shifting, a flicker of unease cutting through the bravado. He sat up fully now, the laptop tumbling to the floor with a dull thud. "You think you're tough, huh? Little Maria with her big gun." He swung his legs off the couch, planting his feet on the ground, his body coiled like a spring. "I'll show you tough." The first shot exploded from the barrel, a deafening crack that shattered the morning. It hit him square in the chest, a red bloom erupting against his skin. His eyes widened, shock replacing the sneer, and he lurched forward, one hand clawing at the air as if to grab the bullet back. Maria didn't flinch. Her training kicked in steady grip, controlled breath, eyes locked on the target, but her mind was a blank slate, a white-hot void where reason should have been. The second shot followed, a heartbeat later, punching into his sternum. He gasped, a wet, ragged sound, and raised his left arm, a futile shield against the storm she'd unleashed. "Maria," he choked out, her name a gurgle in his throat, but she didn't hear it. She didn't hear anything, not the cicadas outside, not the hum of the TV, not the pounding of her own pulse. The world had narrowed to the gun in her hands, the recoil jolting up her arms, the acrid tang of gunpowder stinging her nose. She fired again and again, each shot a punctuation mark to a sentence she'd been writing for years. 3, 4, 5. His body jerked with each impact, slumping sideways, the couch creaking under his weight. Blood spattered the cushions, a grotesque abstract painting against the faded beige fabric. He fell then, a slow, graceless collapse, sliding off the couch to the floor. His back was to her now, broad and vulnerable, the blanket tangled around his legs like a tripped snare. She stepped closer, 2 steps, 3, her boots silent on the hardwood. The 6th shot hit his spine, a clean hole blooming between his shoulder blades. 7, 8, 9. The Glock clicked empty, the slide locking back, but she kept pulling the trigger, her finger moving on instinct, as if she could erase him entirely with the force of her will. 9 bullets, 9 years of swallowed screams, of bruises hidden under long sleeves, of nights spent praying he wouldn't turn his rage on the kids. The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire. It pressed against her ears, a heavy, suffocating weight. Terry lay face down, his cheek mashed into the carpet, a puddle of blood spreading beneath him like spilled ink. His chest heaved once, twice, then stilled. The laptop lay beside him, its screen cracked, the infomercial looping silently, a woman smiling as she scrubbed a stain, oblivious to the carnage inches away. Maria stood over him, the gun still in her hands, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her uniform was pristine, not a drop of blood on it, but her hands shook so violently the Glock rattled against her holster as she slid it back in. She stumbled backward, her hip banging into the kitchen counter. The room spun a kaleidoscope of familiar objects turned alien. The kids' drawings on the fridge, the coffee pot she'd forgotten to turn off, the blanket now soaked red. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself, gripping the edge of the sink. "Oh God," she whispered, the words barely audible. A prayer or a curse, she couldn't tell. Her eyes darted to the hallway. Micah and Lily, still asleep, still safe. She had to keep them safe. The phone was on her duty belt, clipped there since she'd dressed. Her fingers fumbled with it, slick with sweat, and she dialed 911 before she could think too hard. The line connected, and a voice calm, steady cut through the haze. 911 emergency. What's your situation? I need the police, Maria said, her voice cracking like dry twigs. Market Boulevard in Loxahatchee. I just shot him. He was trying to kill me. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Did you say you just shot him? The operator asked, her tone sharpening. Yes, Maria said. I shot him. He was trying to kill me. Please, hurry. Okay, ma'am, stay with me. Where did you shoot him? I don't know his front, his back, a lot of times. She glanced at Terry's body, his stillness unnerving. He's on the floor, in the living room. Can you check if he's breathing? We can start chest compressions if... No, Maria cut in, her voice rising. I'm scared to go over there. If he's awake, he might attack me. Does he have a gun? Any weapons? No, not on him, she said, her eyes scanning the room. There's a machete in the bedroom, a gun in the closet, but not with him. I don't know. Her gaze landed on the golf club near the couch, the blanket half covering it. She'd seen him swing it once, not at her, but at the wall, leaving a dent she'd covered with a picture frame. Where's your gun now? The operator asked. In my holster, Maria said. On me. I was getting ready for work. She touched the Glock, its metal cool against her fingertips, a lifeline she couldn't let go of yet. Okay, listen carefully. I need you to put the gun somewhere safe before deputies arrive. Can you do that? Maria nodded, though the operator couldn't see her, and moved to the fridge. She reached up, placing the Glock on top, out of sight, her arm trembling as she let it go. It's on the refrigerator, she said, her voice steadier now, clinging to the operator's calm like a raft in a storm. Good. Stay where you are. Help's on the way. Were you arguing before this? Yes, Maria said, leaning against the counter, her eyes fixed on Terry's body. Since 1 a.m. He was mad on the phone. Then he came home, and he wouldn't stop. He kept saying he'd kill me, so many times. The operator's voice softened. I know you're scared. Just hold on. Deputies are close. Maria didn't respond. She watched Terry, waiting for him to move, to rise up and lunge at her like he'd done so many times before. But he didn't. He was gone, really gone, and the realization hit her like a punch, stealing her breath. She slid to the floor, her back against the cabinets, the phone pressed to her ear. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, a lifeline cutting through the fog. Minutes later, or maybe seconds, time had lost all meaning. The front door burst open. Deputies stormed in, guns drawn, their voices a cacophony of commands. Hands up. On the ground, Maria raised her arms, still clutching the phone, her uniform marking her as one of their own, a customs agent, not a stranger. I'm here, she said, her voice small but clear. I called. It's me. A deputy young, with sharp eyes approached, his weapon lowering slightly. You the shooter? He asked, glancing at Terry's body. Yes, she said, meeting his gaze. He was going to kill me. He nodded, holstering his gun, and gestured for her to stand. She did, slowly, her legs unsteady, and stepped outside as more officers flooded the house. The street was alive now, flashing lights, radios crackling, neighbors peering from behind curtains. Maria stood on the porch, her arms crossed, the morning air cool against her sweat-damp skin. She wasn't crying, wasn't screaming. She was empty, a shell hollowed out by what she'd done. EMTs rushed past her, their gear clanking, but she knew it was too late. Terry was dead, she'd made sure of it. A female deputy stayed with her, Asking questions, she answered mechanically. Yes, we were arguing. No, he didn't have a weapon. Yes, I shot him 9 times. Her only request was for her children Micah and Lily, still inside, still asleep, she hoped. Call my sister, she said. Don't let them see this. The deputy nodded, scribbling in a notebook, and Maria turned her gaze to the street. The sun was rising now, painting the sky a soft pink, a cruel contrast to the blood on her hands, figurative, not literal, but just as real. She'd killed him. 9 shots. And as the cuffs clicked around her wrists, the weight of it settled in not regret, not yet, but a question that would haunt her. Was this freedom or damnation? The holding cell smelled of bleach and despair, a cold concrete box where Maria Thompson sat, her wrists still raw from the cuffs. It was mid-morning now, hours after the shots that had torn through Terry's body and her life, but time felt like a thread unraveling, pulling her back through years she'd tried to bury. The deputies had taken her uniform evidence. They'd said leaving her in a shapeless gray jumpsuit that hung loose on her frame. Her hair, freed from its tight bun, fell in tangled strands across her face, a curtain she didn't bother to push aside. She stared at the wall, tracing cracks in the paint, but her mind was elsewhere, back to 2000, to a sunlit campus in Gainesville, Florida, where it all began. Maria had been 20 then, a junior at the University of Florida, a quiet girl from a small town with big dreams and bigger doubts. She'd grown up in a clapboard house in Okeechobee, the kind of place where the air always smelled of swamp and gasoline, where her mother worked double shifts at a diner and her father drank away what little they had. College was her escape, a scholarship her lifeline, and she'd thrown herself into its psychology major, late nights in the library, a life of careful steps. She wasn't the type to draw attention. Her clothes were secondhand, her voice soft, her eyes always darting to the edges of a room. Boys didn't notice her, and she didn't mind. Until Terry. He'd been 33, a grad student in criminology, a man who walked into every room like he owned it. She met him at a lecture hall mixer, some dull event about criminal profiling she'd attended for extra credit. He'd stood out immediately, tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried over the hum of chatter, a laugh that turned heads. His hair was dark then, his eyes a piercing green, and he'd caught her staring from across the room. "You look lost," he'd said, sidling up with a beer in hand, his grin crooked and charming. "Need a guide?" She'd blushed, stammering something about the lecture, but he didn't let her flounder. He talked about his travels, his time in the military, the cases he'd studied, and she listened, captivated. He was everything she wasn't: confident, worldly, unafraid. When he asked her out a week later, she said yes without hesitation, her first real date with a man who seemed to see her when no one else did. They went to a diner off campus, splitting fries and milkshakes, and he'd leaned across the table to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're different," he'd said. "Not like the others." She'd believed him. For 2 years, it was a fairy tale, or as close as Maria had ever come to one. They were friends first, then lovers, a slow burn that felt safe. He'd drive her to class in his old Jeep, blasting Springsteen, and she'd sit shotgun, laughing at his stories. He'd tease her about her shyness, coaxing her out of her shell with gentle persistence. "You've got a spark, Maria," he'd say. "Don't hide it." She didn't have much to compare him to, no exes, no flings, but he was her world, a sun she orbited without question. The age gap didn't bother her. If anything, it made her feel protected, like he knew things she didn't, could guide her through a life she'd barely begun to navigate. But there were cracks, even then, if she'd looked closer. He'd get quiet sometimes, a shadow crossing his face when she mentioned her friends' girls from her dorm, a study group she liked. "You don't need them," he'd say, his tone light but edged. "You've got me." She'd laugh it off, chalk it up to jealousy, but it planted a seed. By 2003, when he graduated and took a job in Tampa, their relationship stretched thin across the miles. She'd visit on weekends, burning through her savings for bus tickets, and he'd meet her at the station, all smiles until he wasn't. "Who'd you talk to on the way?" he'd ask, his eyes narrowing. "Some guy hit on you, didn't he?" She'd deny it, confused, but the questions kept coming, a drip that turned into a flood. The shift came in 2007, the year he proposed. She'd finished her degree by then, landed a training spot with U.S. Customs in Miami, and he'd moved closer, taking a security gig in Broward County. They were living together in a cramped apartment, her life revolving around his. The ring came on a humid August night, a simple band he slid onto her finger over takeout pizza. "Marry me," he'd said, not a question but a statement, and she'd nodded, tears in her eyes, thinking this was love. A week later, he hit her. It was over nothing, a co-worker's name she'd mentioned, a man she'd laughed with during a shift. "You're cheating on me," Terry had roared, his face red, his hands balled into fists. She'd barely gotten out a no before his palm cracked across her cheek, sending her stumbling into the kitchen counter. The pain was sharp, but the shock was worse, a cold wave that drowned her. He'd crumpled after, sobbing, pulling her into his arms. "I'm sorry, baby," he'd whispered. "I just love you so much. I can't lose you." She'd forgiven him, clinging to his remorse like a lifeline, telling herself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. The wedding was in August 2008, a small affair at a courthouse, her in a white sundress, him in a borrowed suit. She was pregnant with Lily by then, a surprise that had softened him for a while. He'd rub her belly, call her his little mama, and she'd think maybe this was a new start. But the softness faded. By the time Lily was born in 2009, the violence was routine. He'd shove her for forgetting groceries, slap her for talking back, choke her when he thought she'd looked at another man. "You're mine," he'd hiss, his breath hot against her ear. "Don't forget it." She didn't leave, couldn't, she told herself. She had no money, no family nearby, and a baby to protect. When Micah came in 2013, it was the same, a brief truce, then the storm. The years blurred into a haze of survival. Terry quit his job in 2015, claiming disability from an old injury, and lived off her paycheck, his control tightening. He dictated her clothes, nothing too tight, too short, her hours, her friends. She'd lost touch with everyone from her old life, her world shrinking to the house on Market Drive, a rental they'd moved into in 2016. The kids grew, their laughter a fragile light in the dark, but Terry's shadow loomed over them too. He'd yell at Lily for spilling juice, threaten Micah with a belt for crying. "I'll toughen them up," he'd say, and Maria would step in, taking the brunt to shield them. The weapons started then, knives hidden in drawers, a machete by the bed, a golf club he'd swing like a warning. "You never know when I'll use it," he'd say, smirking, and she'd lie awake, imagining the blade at her throat. He'd choked her unconscious once, in 2018, after she'd smiled at a neighbor. She'd woken to him splashing water on her face, laughing. "See what you made me do," he'd said. Her neck never recovered chronic pain, herniated discs, injections she hid from him because he hated doctors. "You're fine," he'd snap. "Stop whining." By 2019, she was a ghost in her own skin. She'd tried to leave once, in 2017, packing a bag while he was out. He'd caught her at the door, dragged her back by her hair, and held a knife to her throat. "Try that again," he'd whispered, "and I'll kill you and the kids. I'll cut their heads off and make you watch." She'd stayed, paralyzed by fear, her job her only escape until August 8th, when the call came, and the night that never ended began. Back in the cell, Maria curled her knees to her chest, the memories a weight she couldn't shake. She'd loved him once, or thought she had. She'd built a life with him, borne his children, endured his fists. And now he was dead, 9 bullets her final word. The deputies would ask why she hadn't called for help sooner, why she hadn't run. They wouldn't understand, couldn't, the cage he'd built around her, the terror that had become her air. She closed her eyes, seeing his face, hearing his voice. "I'll kill you." She believed him, and in the end, she'd killed him first. The courtroom in the 15th Judicial Circuit of Palm Beach County smelled of polished wood and nervous sweat, a sterile arena where Maria Thompson's fate would be decided. It was the summer of 2024, nearly 5 years since the morning she'd emptied her Glock into Terry Thompson's body, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The gallery was packed, reporters scribbling in notebooks, neighbors from Market Drive whispering behind cupped hands, a handful of customs agents in civilian clothes watching their colleague with guarded eyes. Maria sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale but composed. The ankle monitor she'd worn under house arrest was gone, replaced by a simple black dress that hung loose on her frame, a widow's garb, though no one called her that. The prosecution's table was a fortress of files and certainty, led by Assistant State Attorney Karen Black, a woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper words. She stood as the jury filed in 12 men and women, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease, and began her opening statement with a voice that cut through the room like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this is a case of cold-blooded murder. On August 9th, 2019, Maria Thompson didn't just shoot her husband, Terry Thompson, once. She shot him 9 times, twice in the chest, 7 in the back, while he lay unarmed on their living room floor. She had 15 minutes to think, to plan, to choose. And she chose death." Maria didn't flinch as Black's words landed, though her attorney, Jessica Mitchell, scribbled furiously beside her. The prosecution's narrative was clear: premeditation, not panic. Black paced before the jury, her heels clicking on the tile. "You'll hear about their troubled marriage, about arguments and insults. But Florida law is clear: words are not a death sentence." Maria Thompson wasn't in imminent danger. She was angry, fed up, and she executed her husband in a fit of rage. 9 bullets isn't self-defense. It's vengeance. Mitchell rose next, her voice softer but steel-edged, a counterpoint to Black's aggression. "This isn't about vengeance," she said, her gaze sweeping the jury. "It's about survival." Maria Thompson lived in a prison of fear for over a decade, beaten, choked, threatened with death by a man who had knives in their home and promised to slaughter her children. On that morning, she knew with a certainty forged by years of terror that Terry Thompson would kill her if she didn't act. 9 shots. That's not calculation. That's desperation. The trial unfolded over 6 sweltering days, each a battle of perception. The prosecution called its first witness, Daniel Steelman, a crime scene reconstructionist from Baldwin County, Alabama, with a drawl as steady as his analysis. He stood before a projector, pointing to photos of the living room, Terry's body sprawled, blood pooling, the couch askew. "Ballistics show the first 2 shots hit his chest," Steelman said, tracing red dots on the screen. "He raised his arm, defensive posture, then fell. The next 7 were to his back, delivered as he lay prone. No misses. No hesitation." Black leaned in. "And what about weapons near Mr. Thompson?" "None," Steelman replied. "A golf club was 5 feet away, a blanket tangled around him. No gun, no knife within reach. We found a machete in the bedroom, a pistol in a safe, nothing he could have used. So he posed no immediate threat?" "Not based on the scene," Steelman said, his tone neutral but damning. Maria stared at her hands as Steelman spoke, her fingers tracing the faint scar on her wrist, a burn from a fight years ago, when Terry had pressed a hot pan against her skin. She remembered that morning differently. His voice, "I'll kill you," echoing from the couch. The golf club he'd once swung at the wall, the knives he'd bragged about hiding. She hadn't checked his hands, she couldn't. She'd just known. The state's case built on precision. Black called deputies who'd arrived at Market Drive, their testimony painting Maria as calm, detached. She walked out in her uniform. "No tears, no injuries," one said. Said he'd threatened her. But her phone was on her belt. "She could have called us earlier." They showed the 911 tape, her voice trembling but clear. "I shot him. He was trying to kill me." Black paused it there, turning to the jury. 15 minutes in that bedroom, getting ready for work. Time to calm down, to call for help. Instead, she chose murder. Mitchell's cross-examination was relentless. "Deputy, did you find a bulletproof vest on the couch?" she asked. "Yes," he admitted, draped over the armrest. "And a golf club nearby?" "Yes, but not in his hand. Close enough to grab?" "Possibly," he conceded, shifting uncomfortably. Mitchell pressed on, calling Maria's sister, Carla, who'd taken the children that morning. Carla's voice broke as she spoke. "She called me at 6:15, said, 'Get them out. Don't let them see.' She was terrified, not cold. I've seen her bruises, heard Terry's threats. He called me once, said he'd kill us all if she left him." The defense's cornerstone was Dr. Michael Brandon, a forensic psychologist with wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet authority. He took the stand on day 4, his report in hand. "Maria Thompson suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and battered spouse syndrome," he said. "Years of physical and sexual abuse altered her perception of danger. To her, Terry's threats weren't empty, they were promises." Black crossed him, skeptical. "So she imagined a threat?" "No," Brandon said. "She believed it, based on experience. He'd choked her unconscious, held knives to her throat, threatened her kids. That morning, his words, "If you come out, I'll kill you," were a trigger. She acted to survive. And 9 shots. Black pressed. "Panic," Brandon replied. A trauma response, not a plan. The courtroom tensed when Maria took the stand on day 5, her voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell guided her gently. "Tell us about that night," she said. Maria swallowed, her eyes darting to the jury. "He called at 1 a.m., mad, yelling I was a bad wife, a bad mother. When he got home, it got worse. He said he'd kill me, cut my son's head off. I tried to calm him, massaged his feet, but he wouldn't stop. At 6 o'clock, I went to get ready for work. He said if I came out, he'd kill me. And when you did?" Mitchell asked. He sat up, looked at me like he'd do it. "I was sure I'd die. The kids too. I shot him. I don't remember how many times. It was so fast. Black's Cross was brutal. 15 minutes in that room, Miss Thompson. Why not call 911 then?" "I was scared," Maria said, tears welling. "My phone was with me, but I thought he'd hear, come after me." "You shot him in the back," Black said. "He was falling, unarmed. That's not self-defense." "I didn't know," Maria whispered. "I just knew he'd kill me." The closing arguments were a clash of worlds. Black stood tall, her voice ringing. "She had options, call us. Leave, anything but murder. 9 bullets isn't fear, it's intent." Terry Thompson was no saint, but he didn't deserve execution. Mitchell countered, her tone raw. Maria didn't have options. She had a man who'd beaten her for years, who'd threatened her kids, who'd made her believe death was seconds away. Those 15 minutes weren't calm, they were terror. She shot to live. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, the courtroom silent as a tomb. Maria sat, staring at her hands, her mind replaying Terry's face, charming, then cruel, then still. At 3 p.m., the foreman stood. "In the case of State of Florida versus Maria Thompson, we find the defendant not guilty." A gasp rippled through the room. Maria's head dropped, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mitchell hugged her, whispering, "You're free." Deputies cleared the gallery, but Maria barely noticed. 5 years house arrest, separation from her kids, the weight of guilt and relief lifted, leaving her hollow but alive. Outside, the sun blazed, indifferent. She stepped into it, a woman unmoored, the shadow of Market Drive still clinging to her soul. The house on Market Drive stood empty now, its windows dark, the for sale sign weathered by months of Florida sun. Maria Thompson sat in a new apartment across town, a small place with bare walls and secondhand furniture, her children's laughter echoing from the next room. It was late 2024, months after the verdict that set her free, and she was still learning to breathe without fear. Micah, now 11, and Lily, 12, had rushed into her arms that day, their hugs a lifeline after 5 years apart. They didn't ask about Terry, not yet, and she didn't speak of him, though his shadow lingered in her dreams. Therapy helped, unraveling the knots of guilt and terror, but some threads stayed tangled. She'd killed a man 9 shots, 9 screams she'd never voiced, and the world had judged her not guilty, but her heart wasn't so sure. At night, she'd traced the scars he'd left on her wrist, her neck, her soul wondering if freedom was worth this weight. Yet when Lily smiled or Micah hugged her, she felt it, a fragile piece, a chance to rebuild. The shadow was fading, slowly, and Maria was learning to live in the light.